Hey Artnerds, today we are doing a graphite transfer demonstration and a brush inking demonstration. This is kind of a partner to my nib inking demonstration, and we're going to be using Canson's illustration artboard. So I have here my blue lines printed out onto just plain old copy paper. I've applied a bunch of graphite to the back, and now I'm using a pencil to just basically trace over, applying pressure, my image, and that's going to transfer my image onto my paper. And as always, I apologize for my big old honker getting in the way of the shot. Once you've finished tracing it, you can remove the paper and you have your graphite transfer there. So for this, I'm going to be using an alcohol marker safe ink. So that is Kaime Drawing Sol K ink. It's a little bit hard to get a hold of. I'd love to see wider distribution. I'm also going to be using my Dinky Dips and my Dinky Dip holder. And I'm also using a very small Creative Mark Rhapsody brush. I believe this is in a size 1. So the Kaime Sol K bottle doesn't have an eyedropper attached, so I'm going to use a small plastic pipette here. So we give our Drawing Sol K a bit of a shake just to redistribute our particles, and we struggle to open the bottle, but eventually we succeed. So inking with a brush has a few more considerations than inking with a nib. I prefer to use natural hair brushes when I do brush inking. I know that some people have ethical concerns about that. I totally respect that. I've tried to find good synthetic stand-ins. There's none that I'm 100% comfortable with using, but I do use them when I'm teaching brush inking to my class. So if you guys are looking for synthetic brush recommendations for your brush inking, you can check the description below and I'll have a few. So I'm using a Creative Mark Rhapsody Kolinsky Sable brush. Kolinsky Sable is a type of mink from Russia, and sometimes they're harder to get a hold of than other times. They tend to be kind of expensive because they do have to be imported, and we don't always have the best relationship with Russia, so sometimes they're a little bit rarer than others. The Winsor & Newton Series 7 Kolinsky Sable brush used to be very highly recommended. It is more expensive than the Creative Mark one. It does perform a bit better, but the Creative Mark one is sold through Jerry's Artorama, and it's more affordably priced and has a smaller, shorter brush on the tip. So that's my preference. I find it easier to control and it fits into my budget a bit better. So with these brushes, care is really important, and I have a lot of tutorials for preparing and caring for your natural hair brushes here on the channel, as well as over on NattoSoup, or nattosoup.blogspot.com, sorry. So if you're looking for help and guidance, I highly recommend you check out some of my other wonderful resources, and I'll try to link those throughout. So what I'm doing is I'm just kind of doodling, warming up my hand, priming the brush. I dip it into water first, then I dip it into the ink, and I get the excess ink off onto a piece of cardstock. So now I'm ready to begin inking, or as ready as I'll ever be. I do have a confession to make. I started inking this piece at the end of my Inktober day. So I'd already done the dip pin ink, or the dip pin nib piece that you guys have seen, and I'd already sketched out my next day's Inktober. My hand was already pretty shot when I decided to tackle this piece. So what I would recommend for best control if you want to ink with a brush is start fresh. do your morning drawing warm-ups, maybe do a little bit of figure drawing, get the hand all warmed up, the muscles all limber, the chicky tenders, get the tendons all loosened up, and then start brush inking. And just like with any other type of inking, I recommend that you do it with controlled breathing. So listen to something calming, listen to something relaxing, try to control your breathing. I find that when I'm pulling steadier lines, and you pull towards you, not necessarily push away from you, when I'm pulling lines, if I have steady breathing and I pull as I inhale or as I exhale, I tend to pull better lines. So as with most of my other inked pieces, I begin with the faces because those are the most important on an illustration, in my opinion. That's where people are going to notice mistakes. And I'm working with a blotter sheet to A, protect smearing. We're using a very soft graphite for the graphite transfer. And B, to protect the paper from the oils in my hands. So when this piece is finished, or finished inking and dried and cured and erased, I want to color it with alcohol markers. So I switched over to his Lilliputian wife. She's slightly overlapping him. And I also want to ink mostly the faces before I move on to other things. As mentioned earlier, that's the area that if you mess up, people are going to notice it the most. And I'm working with such a small brush because A, my hand is shot for the day, so I can't really control a larger brush. And B, it's what I had on hand and what I had handy. So you work with what you have. And C, I'm working with a lot of really fine details that requires a lot of control. And you guys can see my head entering the shot. I do apologize for that. Unfortunately, I need to be able to see what I'm doing, and sometimes that means I do cross over the camera. So I apologize for that. So inking with a brush is one of those things that you're going to improve as you practice. You're going to get better as you put the time in, but there's a really high, I don't want to say failure rate, but meh rate as you're starting and as you're finding the right brush for yourself and you're getting used to it and you're figuring out how your brush is going to handle with different types of ink and what papers you prefer inking on. There's so many variables. When I'm inking with a brush, as we're doing today, I like to work with, as I mentioned earlier, a natural hair brush, a Kolinsky Sable brush. I like the Winsor Newton Series 7. I like the Creative Mark Rhapsody brushes. Princeton makes a 7050 Kolinsky brush. That's good as well. Those are the three that I personally recommend. I like to ink on something that has a little bit of tooth. The paper I'm inking on today, the illustration board, is fairly smooth, but it's not like plate Bristol smooth, which might be a little too smooth for my preference with brush. But I really like inking with brush on watercolor papers, particularly Strathmore's watercolor paper or Fabriano Studio watercolor paper, something that has a lot of texture that you can really see sort of the dry brush, crackly grittiness that you can get with a brush. Another thing about brushes is that you can really vary your line art with a single brush. You can pull very, very fine lines. You can apply some pressure and pull very thick lines. But the thing about brush is that it's very much about control. Controlling your ink flow, controlling how much water you use, controlling how often you clean your brush, controlling your papers and the inks that you're using, controlling your hands, controlling your line weights. I've mentioned in other videos that I'm very heavy-handed, so brush inking for me, it's a very delicate process that takes a lot of care and a lot of attention to detail. It's something I have to kind of labor over. I can't just whip it out quickly. It's something that I have to be very precious and specific about. And there are a lot of artists who can ink beautiful things with a brush, and they can ink it very quickly. So if you don't fall into that camp, don't be disheartened. Brush can still be for you. I still use brush. I did my mermaid in 2000, I want to say 18, using a larger brush on Fabriano Studio paper, and I'm very happy with how it turned out. So don't get discouraged if you struggle with it a bit. So as with most pieces that I ink, faces first, then overlap. So you can see the daughter of the family is overlapping the mom. And she has a little lizard pet who's kind of curled up around her neck. This illustration was from my Inktober 2018 Lilliputian Living, so Lilliputian Living Volume 2, which was all about families and seasons and different types of Lilliputians. And you guys can get Volume 1 and Volume 2 on Gumroad. My wonderful art nerds over on Patreon have free access, I believe, to both of them. And if you see me at a show, I have print copies for sale usually. And since people have been asking about it, I do plan on listing Volumes 1 through 3 in my Natto shop once I finish Inktober 2019. So now that all the faces have been inked, it's time to move on to the easier stuff, mostly just pulling long lines carefully with a brush. So in the dip pin inking tutorial that I recently shared, I talk about how if you fix your eye on your endpoint, it's easier to draw a straight or fairly straight, smooth line. And that's a technique that I used on his vest, that I used on the bottom part of her shirt dress, and that I'm going to use on the daughter's bloomers. And I apologize that Bowie is meowing up a storm in the background. He really wants to hop on my lap, and that's really just not going to happen. So I believe I spent about an hour inking this piece. If you're newer to brush inking, give yourself lots of time. If you've been doing it for a while, you'll be more confident, you'll be able to ink faster. I also recommend if you're new to inking with a brush, you practice inking first before you try to pull out the nice piece and try to get that accomplished. I know that the artists that you look up to make these things look incredibly easy, incredibly fast. And speaking of fast, this has been sped up about 4 times. Just keep that in mind. But there's a learning curve for everyone. And I hate seeing artists get discouraged when they can't pick something up immediately because they've seen it in a tutorial and they think they should be able to recreate it with perfection immediately. Everything has a learning curve, everything takes time, and brush inking is absolutely no exception. The more you practice it, the better you're going to get. Now, if you want to practice your brush inking, one thing I recommend you do is you print out, let's say, 4 heads, all the same head, on a large sheet of Strathmore Vellum Bristol, and just practice inking it over and over again. I know that sounds boring, but the repetition is going to allow you to focus on other things like varying your line weights or trying different things with the brush. Focusing more on how often you clean your brush and when you need to clean your brush, rather than focusing on trying to make a good piece or a piece you feel like you can sell. One of the problems with being an artist in the 2000s is just that everything feels like it has to be saleable, it has to be monetized, and it means we don't give ourselves the time to learn the craft like we should. There's so much pressure to be competitive and to try to earn money and to stand out from the crowd that sometimes we forget that we need to invest time into improving ourselves. So I apologize for the bit of the lecture / pep talk, but as your comics big sis, it is my job to look out for you to the best of my ability. So now we've got a lot of those long, straightish lines figured out. We're moving on to inking the feet. So when I did the graphite transfer, it cut off at the feet just a bit. Not a problem. I sketched that in using a soft pencil. Now something I want to point out is I used a Lyra 6B lead for my graphite transfer, and after I erased this, so we're talking future talk now, I allowed this piece to dry for at least 24 hours. I call that curing. It allows the ink to bond to the paper. It's much less likely to ghost. I used a very soft eraser to erase it. I used a vanish eraser and I used a white stroke, and it still ghosted my ink. It still pulled up some of my ink, and I had difficulty removing all of the graphite from the paper. So just keep that in mind. I do recommend using a very soft graphite for your graphite transfer, but perhaps Lyra water-soluble graphite, which is what I used, is not ideal for your use case. So I'm going to marker this piece using alcohol markers at a later date. That's why we use the Kaime Sol K. It is an alcohol marker safe ink. And I didn't do as many details as I would if this was intended just for black and white. Because I'm going to carry a lot of that using color. So please don't take me doing what I call open line work as like, this is the definitive way to ink with a brush and add detail with a brush and these are the rules, because that's absolutely not the case. I highly recommend you go check out other artists and see how they handle brush inking, what they use brushes for, and take inspiration from that as well. So I want to thank you guys so much for hanging out with me, helping me ink this piece, watching this video. This is actually part of a larger review. I am doing field tests on the Canson art boards, the watercolor, the mixed media, and this illustration art board. So if you're curious about this heavier paper, you want to learn more about it, keep an eye on this channel for the full review. If you guys like what I do, please consider subscribing, join the Art Nerd community, and if you'd like to continue to support my efforts, you can head on over to patreon.com/natosoup to join the Art Nerd community. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys again soon.